Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Maartje.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we're talking about The Best Years of Our Lives, which came out in 1946. It was directed by William Wyler and written by Robert E. Sherwood, based on Glory for Me, a 1945 novella by war correspondent McKinley Cantor. It was a winner of 7 Academy Awards, including all the big ones: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Supporting Actor, and Best Screenplay. And it won an extra honorary award for Harold Russell. The film is about 3 men having to readjust to civilian life after World War II, and if you'd like to watch it, it's actually available for free on the Internet Archive. What did you think of this movie?
I really enjoyed this movie, but I thought it was rather long. It's 2 hours and 15 minutes. That's quite a sit down. But I really like the fact that it's a post-war movie, and we'd not done many of those yet, so I find that really interesting. And it's another one of those movies that doesn't really glorify the war at all, which I always find refreshing. You find that newer movies tend to be, hooray, war. And this one was definitely not that. I thought it was really well acted. I liked the dialogue, and I also liked the production value again. For something so old, I'm just really impressed. How about you?
Yeah, I always think it's interesting to watch a movie that, for all intents and purposes, isn't really a war movie, except that you can see the war. It's in the way it's imprinted itself on these 3 men. And it's extremely character driven. Not much quote unquote happens if you're talking about plot, but you're really getting these 3 guys come home and then everything that sort of unfurls from that. I thought that the movie is kind of long. I mean, I started finding it a little long by the end, but I also watched it at night and I was ready to go to bed. But the one nice thing that I thought was that all of the scenes are really unrushed. And so you really get to sit with the characters and their emotions. And it's not just we deliver exposition to each other and then bang, next scene. And I enjoyed that aspect of it. I enjoyed that there were a lot of female characters that were not just hat racks. They were all different from each other. They had things to do. So yeah, by and large, I did enjoy this movie.
I thought it was interesting too that I don't know if it's because we've watched more older movies now, but I find myself less distracted by the fact that it's old. Like, I think I might be starting to actually really enjoy these classics, which I like. It makes me feel appreciative of the time more in movie terms.
Yeah, it's because we've talked about this before, how everything that's made is a product of its time, and everything is really informed by the era in which it was made. And so we're getting this movie that, as you said, does not glorify the war, and it's really not, the movies that came out in the 90s and 2000s were very like gung-ho about the greatest generation. And this movie is made by people who, were of the quote unquote greatest generation, about people who were of the quote unquote greatest generation. And it's a lot darker and a little sad in places and more realistic, I think, than a lot of stuff that came later, which I think is super interesting because it did come out immediately after the war.
And it was also really funny. I thought the characters in particular were quite funny, even though it's also kind of tragic because they drink and then they get funny, but they drink obviously because they've been in a war. So it's sad and funny at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. Much like life.
Yes, let's get into the movie. We open in 1945, where we meet our 3 war veterans as they encounter one another on a B-17 transport that happens to be heading to their hometown of Boone City, Ohio. I've never been. I'm sure it's good.
It's not a real place.
Oh, it's fake. Never mind then.
It's based on Cincinnati, apparently.
All right. They are U.S. Air Force Bombardier Captain Fred Derry, played by Dana Andrews, U.S. Navy Petty Officer Second Class Helmer Parrish, played by Harold Russell, and U.S. Army Sergeant L. Stephenson, played by Frederick March. As they journey home together, they discuss their lives before the war, and they are excited to see their hometown come into view through the window.
I thought it was super interesting that they're flying home on this B-17. Technically, they're not supposed to be doing that because once you're out of the army, you're not supposed to be hitching rides in this way, but everyone's just turning a blind eye and letting returning veterans do it. And so they're all sitting in where the bombardier would sit, like right in the nose of the plane. And just interesting to me that, if you were a bombardier sitting in that position, the character of Fred Derry, even, like a few months earlier, you would be obliterating the countryside below you, and you would be traveling over countryside that had been obliterated. And now they're traveling over this like pristine, beautiful, untouched countryside. And it's such an apt visual metaphor for how different the world that they left behind is from the world that they're going into.
I also thought that Homer in particular, he looks down and he remarks upon his high school and stuff like that. And obviously, Homer, for your information, has lost both his hands, so he's got two hooks instead of hands. And the other two men kind of look at each other as he reminisces about what life used to be like. And they just know that his life is going to be so different. I thought that was really bittersweet, almost, that Homer is still pretty, almost optimistic about going home at this point. And you can tell that it won't be like that for long.
Yeah, because in his memory, right, he was a star high school athlete and his childhood sweetheart lived next door. And now he's going into the unknown. And they did, for what it's worth, hire a disabled actor. Harold Russell also had lost both of his hands. And he was the one who won Best Supporting Actor. And the studio thought, I guess the committee thought, that there was no way that he was going to win Best Supporting Actor. So they put together this special award for him. And so they gave him the special award, and then he did win Best Supporting Actor. So he's the only actor to have ever won 2 awards for the same performance.
Wow. I'm not sure if I'm offended or touched by the special award, to be honest. A little bit of both.
Well, I think it's because he was not an actor, right? Like he was not trying to be an actor. They sort of plucked him out of obscurity. And then after this, he appeared in 1 or 2 other things, but he really kind of left Hollywood and went off to do something else. And so I think part of it was that he really pulled his weight for someone who's, that wasn't really his job.
It seemed really sincere. Like, his entire performance is very honest and sweet and almost innocent in a way, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for some of the parts that he delivers, like the scene later with Wilma where he's showing her the extent of his disability. All those lines would be, much more from the heart for him. I mean, these are probably thoughts and feelings also wrestled with in real life.
Yeah, it's nice.
Worth mentioning, I read the novella this was based on. It's interesting. It's not what I expected. It's completely written in blank verse, so like a poem, but it doesn't rhyme. And it's beautifully written. There are some absolutely stunning passages in it, and I'll read a little bit from it later. But in the book, the character of Homer, his disability is that he has a brain injury. And so he has one side of his body sort of has a mind of its own. And so
it's like me.
Yeah. And so he starts drinking because he finds that the alcohol makes him less disabled.
Wow, that sounds so familiar to me.
Yeah, it's just a little bit different because he's going around, and even when he's not drunk, people think that he's drunk because of his disability. And
oh no.
Yeah, just a little bit of a different thing. I mean, there are some differences from the book to the movie. I'll talk a little bit later about the climactic scene in the book and how they kind of changed it. But yeah, I just thought that one was interesting.
Interesting. Now I want to read the book even more.
The 3 men share a cab to their respective homes once they touch down, and each seems reluctant to face the life that he left behind. One of them says something about feeling similarly now that he's coming home to the way that he felt when he was going to war in the first place. So I guess, a sense of trepidation, going into the unknown and the unexpected. Homer Parrish is worried that his parents and his girlfriend, Wilma, who's his kind of childhood sweetheart, and in the book, they make it clear how young they are because he went to war when he was 16. Now, Wilma is still in high school and he's maybe 18 or 19 years old. And so Wilma in the movie is played by Kathy O'Donnell. He's worried that she won't understand his new disability. Al is worried that things will be different with his wife, Millie, played by Myrna Loy, and 2 children, as well as at his old job as a bank manager. And Fred is returning to a very different life than you might expect from an Air Force captain. He used to work in a drugstore and he grew up on kind of the wrong side of the tracks. And I thought it was super interesting that they did that, where Fred is the Army captain making, I think he says at one point, $400 a month, which is, a good sum at that point. And he comes from this sort of very working class background and he's going to go back to it at the end of the war. Whereas Al is a bank manager. He goes back to his apartment. It's beautiful inside. You can tell that they're quite well off, and he was an enlisted man. So I like that they kind of played with that a little bit.
Yeah, I also like that in the car, Fred clearly wants to be the last one off the taxi. He says to Al, "No, you're going home first," and that's obviously because he might not want Al to see where he lives or where his parents live, which is in a dump, really. And I agree. I did not see it coming. I thought he was going to be this well-off at least slightly fancy captain, but he really is just a working class man, which is what it would have been like, I guess, in some cases at least. And that you can make something of yourself in the army, but then have to go home to a life that's very different.
In sort of that vein, later on, Fred was a bombardier. And as he's going around and trying to get a job, this happens in the movie and in the book as well. It reminded me of that scene in the Pacific where Eugene Sledge goes to, I think it's like a job fair, and they're like, "What skills did you learn?" And he's like, "Well, I learned how to like fire a mortar." And she was like, "Well, do you know how to type?" And this is the same thing kind of with Fred, where he was a great bombardier. He could, land bombs on a dime, but that skill does not really translate to civilian life. And it also relates to nowadays, you always see enlistment propaganda that's like, join the army, it's good for your career, you'll get a job out of it. And this movie really calls into question, are those skills that you learn and the sort of skills that you've come out of the army with, are those going to ultimately be useful? Like, did he really get anything out of that?
No, he really did not. Yeah, it's interesting in that scene that's later on in the movie. He's also asked if he had led anyone, if he had any leadership roles, and he hadn't had any of those. I mean, he's a captain, but he's just a bombardier. So, like you said, not all of it's quite as useful back in real life.
In the book, Fred Derry is like 21 years old. And so the only jobs that he's ever had are guy who works in a drugstore, bombardier, and now he's back, but he doesn't want to be a guy who works in a drugstore anymore. But he didn't really learn any skills that would, allow him to not be a guy who just works in a drugstore. And I think the semi-unfortunate thing with the casting, because I think Dana Andrews did a good job, but also he was in his late 30s when they made this movie. And so
he felt like 40 or something in the movie.
Yeah.
So when Fred comes home to his parents who live at the trackside, he's in for an unpleasant surprise as he finds out that his wife, Mary, played by Virginia Mayo, has moved out of his parents' house and is working in a nightclub. Homer finds that his family is treating him a little oddly because of his new disability, and Al is finding it really hard to settle into his nice apartment with his ordinary family. To deal with this, they go to the bar together. They end up seeing each other in the bar that they've mentioned before. Al brings his wife, Millie, and their daughter, Peggy, played by Teresa Wright, with him to go dancing and clubbing and drinking. And they end up at the bar where they meet Fred, and Fred is very taken with Peggy immediately. And they end up having another drink or two together, and then he is too drunk to go home. So Peggy and Millie take the men home because they're not really awake anymore at this point. Fred sleeps over, and Peggy takes care of him when he has a very scary flashback nightmare, which was a very sweet scene, I thought.
Yeah, I like that one too. I believe they're in a bar that Homer had mentioned his uncle owns, his Uncle Butch or something like that.
Yes.
In the book, it's much more serendipitous. They meet by accident, but in the movie, I guess they were like, we'll just have them come back to this bar that they all know about.
I really liked Butch, by the way, as a piano player. I really like the scene where they play piano together later on.
Yeah.
But I also thought it was kind of, and I'm not sure why they did this, but Homer was also there, and he was only allowed to drink beer for some reason. Maybe because he's so young. Maybe that's why.
Yeah, in the book, he has quite a substantial drinking problem, which they get into a little bit in the movie, but in the book, they emphasize it a lot more. And I wonder if it's supposed to be like in the book, I think it's something like his parents tell the bar owner to like stop serving him. I guess in this case, the trade-off is like, well, if you drink beer, you have to drink it slower and you're probably not going to get as hammered.
What did you think of Peggy? What's your opinion of Peggy?
Yeah, I mean, fine, I guess. Did you have something specific?
No, I thought she was fun, actually. I was afraid they were gonna make her just kind of head over heels for Fred, and that's all, but she's got a mind of her own, which I like. For an old movie, that's pretty good.
Yeah, for sure. Fred does manage to track down Marie, his wife, though it's clear that she's mostly interested in his captain's uniform and the paycheck it brought in. She wants to go out on the town and she wants him to wear his uniform, and he doesn't really want to because he's trying to put all of that in the past. He ends up returning to his old job at the pharmacy because he's got to make some money, and Marie has become accustomed to a certain type of lifestyle. It's a huge cut in pay. He now reports to a previous subordinate. He's really not having a great time. Peggy visits him at the store one day and they have this cute little flirty interaction, and she agrees to go for lunch with him, and then they kiss, which Peggy is very unsure how to feel about it because of course she knows that Fred is married.
And he does too. He says it as well. It's like, this shouldn't have happened. I'm married, but it did. and I guess it had to or something. It's a strange line. But what made me laugh is the scene where Fred is telling his wife that he's going to make her dinner. She doesn't want his dinner. She wants to go out for dinner. I'm like, woman, he's trying to make you dinner. Enjoy it.
Well, he's trying to make her dinner out of a can, which I understand why she.
Yeah, I guess that's true. And also, she liked her job at the nightclub and she quit because he came home. She tells him, I even gave up my job for you. And they're not having a very good time together.
Yeah. Ultimately, when Peggy meets them together, her friend that she's sitting with makes a remark about how Fred and Marie don't actually like each other, which seems pretty apt. It seems like, book Fred is 21, and before he went to war, he was really young. And Marie says something about how this is the first time she's seen him out of his uniform. So they clearly met after he already had gone into the army. So they got married on the fly. I think in the book, they knew each other for like 12 days or something before they got married. It was a really brief whirlwind courtship, and she probably married him because she was impressed with the uniform and the $400 a month and all that stuff. And so
I mean, he looks good in his uniform. Homer is extremely independent. I'm very jealous of Homer, by the way. I wish I was that independent. But he knows how to handle himself and he prefers to do everything himself, which results in him pushing Wilma away, which is not really what he wants to do, but he does it anyway. And at some point, he visits Fred's workplace, and a fellow customer starts to tell him that a sacrifice was pointless, and Fred doesn't like this very much. I would like to mention that Homer first attacks this man, and then Fred kind of steps in and punches him. And that ends up with Fred getting fired, which is not too sad about, actually, I think.
He wasn't having a great time. I don't think he just didn't know what else to do. And in the book, he tries to get a whole bunch of different jobs, but every time they tell him, oh, you're not allowed to smoke here, or oh, you have to do XYZ, he really is not. He's just like, fine, I'll go work somewhere else. Like, he really doesn't. I think he's really struggling to find a purpose.
That makes sense. And of course, in the army, he had one, and it was very clear. And then you come home, and it's suddenly life has moved on without you, and you have to refigure it out, really.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of running motifs in the book, and one of them is something like, how much bombing will they need in Boone City? And so it comes up anytime he basically feels useless and worthless, and he's not suited for this job, and he's not suited for Marie, and he's not suited for whatever. It's this running motif of how much bombing will they require in Boone City? Al returns to his job at the bank. When they offer him a promotion, he doesn't seem that excited about it. I think he went into the army and sort of got his eyes open to the way of the world, maybe. He's now the VP of loans, and he's responsible for administering GI Bill loans. And of course, with the GI Bill loans, the government would guarantee half the loan, but the other half was supposed to be secured by collateral. And he ends up getting in hot water with his boss when he gives a veteran a loan without collateral, because Al believes that he can look at that guy and see that he's of good character, that he served, that he did his part. And so he believes that he's good for it. And the bank is like, well, but you're supposed to have collateral for a loan.
Yeah, what does GI stand for?
General Infantry, I believe.
All right, I know nothing about this, but now I do.
So at the end of World War II, the American government had, and the Canadian government did as well. It wasn't called the GI Bill; it was called something else. Basically, it was legislation that was designed to support returning veterans, and so they would do things like pay for them to go to school, help them get a mortgage, all these different sort of resources to essentially not let veterans down.
That makes sense, actually. And that's good that that existed. I'm not sure how much help it was for most of them, but at least they had something.
Yeah, well, actually, my grandfather bought his first house with help from the GI Bill.
Ah, that's good. Well,
yeah.
I guess it's good for something then.
Yeah, and I believe, I don't remember, some of the guys from Band of Brothers went to college with money from the GI Bill too, if I'm not mistaken.
All right, interesting. Wilma tries to explain several times to Homer that she still very much wants to marry him. She's very sweet. And he doesn't really believe it. And he's practicing shooting his gun one day in some shed. And he sees some kids eyeing his prosthetics. And he breaks a window in a fit of rage. And he's like, look at the weirdo, or look at the monster, or something. And I think one of them is his sister, right? One of those kids, yeah. So you can tell he immediately feels guilty after that.
Yeah, it's so tough because you can tell that he's pushing people away so that he can reject them before they reject him. And Wilma's so genuine, and she doesn't want to reject him. And she's constantly trying to be like, well, I still want to marry you if you still want to marry me.
Yeah. It made me a little sad, this relationship, but thankfully, spoilers, it all works out in the end.
Yeah. Peggy invites Fred and Marie out on a double date with her and a friend, which is wild behavior, in my opinion. She believes that Fred doesn't love his wife, and I guess their family's super tight because she tells her parents this. She's like, Fred doesn't love his wife. I'm gonna break up their marriage. And Al reacts to this, as you might expect, by sitting down with Fred and telling him to stay away from Peggy. And Fred thus tells Peggy that they can't see one another anymore, which she's very bummed out about.
Yeah, the reason she went on this double date to begin with, which is a wild date, by the way. Did you see how they were dancing, how close it was? I was like, how do you breathe in a room like that? But she goes on this date initially to try and make herself not want Fred. She's like, if I meet his wife, then I'll get over him and I'll forget him. But it obviously does not work. They take a photo together, all four of them, and she looks very unhappy. So
Yeah.
sad. Al gets drunk, which is something he does a lot, and he gives a speech at a dinner for bank higher-ups wherein he makes fun of the need for collateral by telling a story about refusing to take a hill on command without collateral in the war. And his wife seems so proud of him for this story. It made me laugh a little bit. I was like, hang on, she was counting the drinks that he'd taken on the tablecloth. And then he does this little speech, and she's super proud of him, and she kisses him. It's really funny.
Yeah. He ends up in the book, he gets fired from the bank.
Aw.
Yeah, and not because of this. He gets fired from the bank because so Fred basically decides that the only way out for him now is he's going to rob a bank. And he goes into the bank where Al worked. And he's right at the front of the line about to rob this bank. And then Al snaps on a customer, just like loses his shit on this lady. And he sees Fred and he's like, come with me, we're going to get a drink. And he like drags him out of there. And so Fred, crisis averted, does not rob the bank. Fred goes back to the place where he's staying. He's been letting Homer stay with him sometimes because Homer gets so drunk that his family doesn't like want him around necessarily because he's just a train wreck. And so Homer's been staying with Fred. And so Fred goes in and leaves his gun and is like, I'm gonna go do some laundry. I'll be back. Homer tries to kill himself, but he fucks it up and doesn't die. And then Al and Fred get together and they speak with Peggy, and then Peggy speaks with Wilma, and then that's how they get kind of like Wilma back to come and deal with Homer. So it's like this whole intense thing that doesn't happen in the movie.
So the book is a lot darker than in the movie is.
Yeah, they really went there in the book in a way that they didn't in the movie. And I was reading about it, and I gather the writer of the novella was not very happy about a lot of the changes that they made.
I mean, I guess. I also understand why they didn't want to make it that dark.
Yeah.
I mean, suicide is intense in any situation, but a bank robbery would have been fun, though, to be fair.
Yeah, and I think part of it too is that you have this young guy. In the movie, it's easy to forget that Fred is young because the actor who's playing him is not that young. But Fred is just this young guy who comes home from the war, goes through a slew of jobs, gets a divorce, and he's just kind of like pinwheeling in the wind, He has no idea what he's supposed to be doing. He doesn't have any tools to deal with this and know how he's supposed to progress forward in his life. And so he has this completely harebrained idea that he's going to rob a bank and then that will solve all of his problems. Like, to me, that's so indicative of how young he is.
Yeah, and how bleak his future is for him, at least in that moment, because he obviously has nothing going for him anymore. He's got no wife, no job. Like, it's pretty bleak. But also, you're right. He's just this boy because he went to war like barely an adult, and he came back still barely an adult, but he didn't really have time to grow up in the meantime.
The book really emphasizes the class difference. At one point, Fred goes to visit Peggy, and she's having this really fancy garden party because of course her dad is Al, the VP at the bank. And he starts to think, like he's never going to be able to offer her anything. And her bright future compared to what he has going for him, the difference is really marked.
Yeah. I guess it's the same in the movie, but it's not as on the nose because it's not said out loud so much, except at the very end for like 1 second. I like that they put these different classes into this movie, though. It's like a slice of society in one movie, which is nice.
Yeah, it's nice to get this really in-depth understanding of all these characters because in a lot of war movies that doesn't happen. for various reasons. Wilma comes one more time to try and get through to Homer. He takes her upstairs to see what it's like when he gets ready for bed, and he has to remove his harness that holds on his hook prosthetics and to show her how helpless it makes him. Like once he takes the prosthetic off, he can't put it back on by himself. He can't turn a doorknob. He can't do anything. And she shows him that she's happy to help. She's like, I'll do up the buttons of your pajama shirt for you, and I'll do this and I'll do that. Yeah, that scene was really emotionally powerful. I think partly because the actor probably had so much real life experience to put into it.
Yes, and I also really like there's a line in the very beginning of the movie. Fred first says, I gotta hand it to the Navy. They sure taught this kid how to use those hooks. And then Al says, but they didn't teach him how to hold his girlfriend. And then in that scene, in his bedroom, he holds her like really sweetly, and I'm like, yes, he does know how to do it, even without the prosthetics, which was really nice.
Yeah, I really like that too.
Fred comes home and finds Marie on her way out for the night with another male friend. She then blatantly tells him she wants a divorce, and Fred seems to agree, and he wants to leave town immediately. So at the airport, he enters a B-17 junction area, and he sits at his old station in the nose of one of the B-17s. And one of the managers on the side approaches him, and he ends up giving Fred a job. After first trying to compare war experiences, and Fred is not having it, he's like, I don't care, I just want a job.
Yeah, I thought this is another really impactful scene because when he goes into this B-17 junking area, the camera sort of pans over all these B-17s that have had like the engine taken out and they're not good for anything anymore. They served their purpose and they were so important. Like now they don't have that purpose anymore, so they're being taken apart. And when he goes and sits in the nose of it, it's like a really strong metaphor for like, yeah, he feels the same way. This is a man who won the war. This is a plane that won the war. And then now they're not useful anymore. But as he's there and they're offering him a job, all of the pieces of these B-17s are going to be repurposed and made into housing. And so if the machinery can be repurposed, maybe he can be too. I saw the exact same thing, which is good. That means they did a good job. And I thought that junking yard was so impressive looking with all the propellers and the fighter planes as well. Just all like ghosts of those planes, really, which I thought was really neat. And it was all very dusty and scary looking. It was a really cool visual for sure. So Fred ends up being the best man at Homer's wedding to Wilma. They have a nice, cute little at-home wedding with Al, Millie, and Peggy also in attendance. Fred and Peggy reunite. He tells her that life will be difficult for them, but she's not worried. She's glowing and she's so happy that he's back with her and happily ever after. And her head falls off as they kiss. Her head does fall off as they kiss. And it is a wild hat, y'all. So we Googled this beforehand because we're like, what the heck is this hat called? It's an open crown cartwheel hat. So it's a hat with a big old brim, but you can see her like hair in the back. Anyway, maybe I'm just a fool who doesn't know anything about hats, but I wasn't sure I'd ever seen that before. And we cheered when the hat fell off. At least I did. I was like, yay! When you make it with a man so hard, your hat falls off. Sam, please read us something from the novella. Yeah, so I just wanted to read a couple little clips from it. The first one that I'll read you is literally the first few lines of the novella. And the second one I'll read you is not the last lines, but it's really, really close to the end. And there's this repeating motif about Fred Derry. And so this is the first time it gets used and the last time it gets used. And yeah, just to give you an idea of how beautifully this is written. So this is the very first few lines. Fred Derry, 21, and killer of 100 men, walked on the width of Welburn Field. The cargo ship had set him down in noontime haze of early spring. He smelled the onion farms. He heard the trucks and Highway 52. He saw the signboards and the ugliness. That was a beauty he had dreamed. So that Fred Derry, 21, and killer of 100 men gets repeated a number of times, and then this is the last time it gets used. Fred Derry, 21, and killer of 100 men, and bound for school with books and strap, not with a bunch of kids the way he'd said, but with the tanker men, the liberator crews, the infantry, the gyrenes coming home, and opening a tome that told how they must ever think and act now they had emptied out their gaunt garens and only felt a kick and thud in memory. He'd try to learn a life. Wow, that last line is really good. Yeah. He tried to learn a life.
That's
Yeah.
good.
In the book, he goes back to school at the end, and essentially he'll get enough money from the government to go to school, get his books paid for, and then he gets a little bit extra on top of that. So it's not a ton of money, but it'll be enough for him and Peggy to get a little
Oh,
teeny time in and buy some food and stuff like that.
bless. I kind of want you to just read this book to me before I go to sleep. Just saying.
Story time.
Yeah. Yeah, I love this movie. I'm really surprised that I like it this much.
Yeah, it was good and interesting that one of the real overarching themes that we see again and again is that these guys come home and initially all of their power is in, they come home and they're in a group and they keep coming back into a group and finding each other again and they don't really know how to relate to the women in their lives and so they keep coming back together to their shared experience. But then ultimately it's like, well, they do have to figure out how they're going to move into their new life and relate to all of these women again. And so we do see that start to happen over the course of the movie. And the women are very supportive and they're there for them, but they're also, in the instance of Peggy, like she's not taking any shit either. I really thought that was a really cool thing to watch.
Yeah, I thought Millie also was quite, as a wife. At the beginning, I wasn't sure if she was happy that he was home. They went out drinking and she looked very unhappy about that specific detail.
So he comes home, and I think we're supposed to imply that they're going to be on their way to go to bed. And then he's like, let's go out. Let's go out on the town. And I
Yeah,
wonder if part of that is like because he hasn't seen her in so long and they haven't been like intimate, they haven't shared a bed, they haven't like even just regular slept in a bed for 8 hours together in so long. I think he's a little bit worried about how that relationship is going to be once they're alone.
yeah. I liked all the supporting characters basically a lot. No role seemed really tiny in this. Like even the uncle, like Homer's uncle was very important in the story. Brad's parents, Millie, just everybody had good roles. I thought that was really nice.
Yeah. Well, I have some notes. Oh,
Give me
smells
some
good coffee.
notes. Give me some notes about this movie making thing.
Yeah, so Samuel Goldwyn of the famous studio exec, Metro Goldwyn Mayer, I think is what the company's called. He wanted to make a movie about returning veterans. He had read a newspaper article, I believe, and he commissioned Cantor, who was the war correspondent who wrote the novella, to put something together. And that novella ultimately got reworked by Robert Sherwood into a screenplay. And Samuel Goldwyn had, I guess, principles that were pretty infamous in the movie industry. And one of the things he often said was, I don't care if the film doesn't make a nickel. I just want every man, woman, and child in America to see it. And supposedly that was inspired by this movie.
That's cool though. I mean, if I know anything about the movie industry today, but probably also back then, is that it needs to make money. So it's nice to have someone say that I don't care if it makes money or not, as long as people go out and see it. That's
Yeah.
nice.
And this movie was really successful. And to this day, it continues to make lists of top 100 movies of the 20th century and that kind of stuff. So it is nice that it did well, that a lot of people saw it. The director, William Wyler, was one of the 5 big Hollywood directors who went overseas with the army to shoot propaganda films. And he's one of the 5 directors that's featured in the documentary, Five Came Back, which I watched a little while ago.
It's on
And
Netflix.
it is on Netflix, yes, if you want to check it out. It was pretty interesting. He had made a movie called Mrs. Miniver in 1941, which was about an English family undergoing a bombing. And there's a part where there's a downed German pilot that they have to deal with. And Wyler was told by studio execs to tone down the anti-German sentiment in the movie because the US wasn't in the war yet. But Pearl Harbor happened like mid-shoot, and he got the green light to change it back.
Oh wow, that's
Yeah,
wild.
right? He was also assigned, I have a bunch of notes about Wyler because it's just so many things happened in this era that just are fascinating to me. So Wyler was assigned with Frank Capra, one of the other directors, to make a propaganda film directed at Black Americans because the government had done a survey in Harlem after Pearl Harbor, and the survey results said that half of the respondents believed they would be no worse off if Japan won the war. And so instead of doing anything about that to change the situation, they're like, I know what we need, a good propaganda movie. The War Department's guidelines on how to depict Black soldiers were so racist that Wyler quit the project.
Wow. Wyler was a white man, but I guess even he could see that it was super racist.
Yeah, He was a white man. He was also Jewish. I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but he went back to his French hometown of Mulhouse near the German border, like right at the end of the war. And the Holocaust had claimed the entire Jewish community, including his family, and only his father's shop sign remained.
That's insane.
Yeah. He also, of course, made Memphis Belle in 1944, and he didn't want to stage it. He wanted it to be totally legit. So he took flight training courses so he could go on sorties with the bomber crews. And they were worried about him being shot down over Germany because he was known to be Jewish. And these missions were super dangerous. I mean, they were no joke. One of his cameramen was actually killed when they were making the movie. And his army career ended because he was permanently deafened from flying many times in a B-25. A lot of the guys who flew those bombers ended up with hearing loss, but apparently the B-25 potentially could be worse because the propellers were really, really close to the pilot's canopy. They were like a foot away. And so if you were sitting in that part of the plane, and they were not super serious about hearing protection. So
I've been next to an anti-aircraft gun that shot blanks, and it's so loud. I figure just any part of World War II was very loud, and no one had any protection.
yeah, well,
I mean,
we also talked about how my grandfather was deaf because
right. Yeah.
fired the big gun at the submarines, and they were like, yep, just lay on the ground and open your mouth to release the pressure on your ears. It's like, well, that does not protect a person's hearing.
Interestingly, We Happy Few 506 has an interview with William Wyler's daughter, Catherine Wyler. That's a really good listen if you want to listen to that. I'll put a link on our website to that.
Nice.
Cool. We do need to rate this movie, Sam. I feel like we can only rate it one thing.
We can only rate it open crown cartwheel hats out of 10. Look, we went through the trouble of looking this up. Now we need to use it.
Yes, I'll go first. I feel like it's another tongue twister, so thanks for that. I'm gonna rate this movie 8.5 open crown cartwheel hats out of 10 because I really, really enjoyed it. I really liked how character driven it was and how different all these men were. They weren't all just a heroic, tough guy. They had their troubles, and I liked seeing those troubles instead of just a heroic guys again. And I really liked all the women in this too. Like you said in the opening, they weren't head wrecks. They had personalities and things to do and opinions, and I liked that a lot. And I did think it was rather long, so maybe if it had been 30 minutes shorter, I would have liked it even more. But overall, it was a very good experience for me. How about you?
Yeah, I enjoyed it as well. I similarly thought it was a bit long, but I also feel like perhaps my attention span was not quite as good as it could have been towards the end. Yeah, I'm going to give it 8 open crown cartwheel hats out of 10. I thought that the story that it told was really important. I thought that it was well told. I thought that the script felt realistic to me, that we really did follow these emotional journeys beat for beat. Like, no reaction didn't feel earned. And I similarly agree that I always, of course, like when there are female characters that aren't hat racks. Myrna Loy, who plays Millie in particular, was really good. A lot of the performances were really strong. So yeah, I definitely recommend it. I think you gotta watch it if you haven't seen it and you're into World War II media.
Agree.
You can follow us wherever you get your podcasts. You can rate us 5 stars. You can send your favorite episode to one of your friends. Tell them to let the dulcet voices of the ladies of Rosie the Reviewer climb down into their ear holes, or however you would word it. You can follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast. You can visit our website, www.rosiethereviewer.com. And are you reading anything new? We just recorded yesterday, so probably not.
No. Are you?
I'm not reading anything new either, but just to give folks a little sneak preview, I bought a couple of books yesterday that I'll be reading over the next couple of weeks while I'm on vacation, and they are the books upon which the movie Lee and the movie Flags of Our Fathers are based.
Just because Sam is going on vacation doesn't mean that we are, because we will be putting out more episodes, just so you know.
Oh yeah, the podcast is not going anywhere. We record things on an absolutely absurd schedule, but yes, there's always an episode every Friday. You don't have to worry about that.
Next week, we're talking about Flags of Our Fathers. All right. See you next week.
Bye.